Hello, everybody. Hello, and welcome to this MedMA webinar on the Eastern Mediterranean in turmoil and what it means for Cyprus. Thank you for being here on such a short notice. So, a few words of introduction to start. The Mediterranean Migration and Asylum Policy Hub was established in 2022 in Athens as an agency of the European Public Organization. And since the summer, the MEDMA has operations in Cyprus as well. Through its presence in Cyprus, it has established collaboration with some exceptional counterparts in Cyprus as well, some of which are present today in our discussions, and we thank them very much for that. We are holding this webinar with the aim of providing first-hand information of what's happening on the ground, with focus on how regional dynamics affect or may affect migration and mobility in the future. So we know that we will try to keep it very tight. We are aware of everybody's time. It's very precious. Please do use the Q&A section for questions, including, if possible, to whom you want to address the question. And we will make the best possible in that short time that we have ahead of us to address most of the questions in the Q&A section after the first remarks from our participants. So without any further delay, I want to give the floor first to Harry Tzimitras. Harry is a professor of international law and the director of the Peace Research Institute Oslo PRIO Cyprus Center, and a dear friend, if I may, who will first guide us through how Cyprus is affected on a broader level and the regional dynamics. Harry, the floor is yours.
Many thanks, dear Eleni, dear good friend Eleni, as you say, and warm greetings to everyone. I'll try to keep it very, very short, and I'll try to do four things, if I may. Firstly, talk about briefly of where Cyprus is in all this. Secondly, how it is involved and why or not involved. Thirdly, how is it affected in the short, medium, and long run? And fourthly, pose a couple of questions, issues not raised, if you like, that would also pave the way towards the more specialized discussion on migration later on. So first of all, to all of you who are located here, and an apologies for the rudimentary information, Cyprus is literally a country in the region, but not of the region. It's only a 20-minute flight from Beirut and a 30-minute flight from Tel Aviv, which means that the missile takes a few seconds up to a couple of minutes, depending on the specifics. It has a national guard, so the rudimentary army, no air force, no navy as such, and yet it is one of the most militarized places on the planet per size and population, with nearly 9 armies in presence. I'm unhappy it has been targeted directly or indirectly. I'm also unhappy that it's taken so very long for the European partners to respond. I'm happier now that some of them decided to somehow show flag, at least in a basic way, to the presidency holder, mind you, so to the very DNA of the European Union. But it also could mean that the situation is further expected to escalate and become more critical. Last point of this, I'm not quite sure whether the deafening silence of the EU until now, or the public statements like Chancellor Merz's ones in DC are more worrying to me. Now, secondly, how is Cyprus involved? If so, and why? And if so, if not, why not? Cyprus is certain, and I'm talking obviously about the Republic of Cyprus. Yes, the EU member state. Cyprus is certainly not non-aligned. Neither can be a crafty wild card like sometimes neighbouring Turkey is. It goes from extremes, from being a country with too close relationships to Moscow, to then being de-Russified, but then going in the opposite direction to developing too close relations with the US, with Israel, with the broader West. It has the highest form of military cooperation with Israel through the Status of Forces Agreement, and the narrative until now has been capitalizing on tripartite alliances, hexagons of allies, strategic partnerships, pillars of stability, iron domes, shields, umbrellas, a Barak Israeli defense and air defense system, to frameworks of upgraded strategic relationships, quote unquote, to the facilitation of the US military presence in the Andreas Papandreou base in Paphos, for the French in the Charilos Florakis base in Marie, with French moorings, with UK sovereign bases reported also to be carrying nuclear depots, to an EU member state, to Israeli nationals residing in Cyprus in the thousands now, to obviously the political problem of division on the ground, and to a Turkey that has not only a very close proximity as a neighbor, but also physical presence, military strategic presence on the island. So I think it's a little bit tight, if you like, on how things are. And I think the recent strikes brought home the realization in Cyprus, at least in the public, versus the official narrative, that allies cannot be taken for granted in the way we thought about them. There's discontent with the British government and others. There's disillusionment on the ground. And so I think, the nice narrative that Cyprus is not engaged, it will never be engaged, it never wishes to be engaged, is challenged in the minds of the public. Now, what is the outlook for how is it affected in the short, medium, and long term? In the short term, Cyprus is very vulnerable to attacks. It doesn't matter if they're directed against the UK sovereign bases; they physically take place on the geography of Cyprus. Cyprus has also a lot, as I said, of Israeli economic targets in place. So attacks could be targeted against those Israelis, but physically Israeli targets, but then physically again on Cyprus geography. I remind you that Nasrallah, before his death, physically threatened Cyprus in June of 2024, and then the IRGC commander on this past Monday, on the 2nd, also physically targeted and threatened Cyprus. So Cyprus is very vulnerable in direct terms to attacks. Secondly, it's open to accidents. In July 2019, a rogue S-200 missile from Syria hit the mountain 5 miles north of Nicosia. Yes, a pure accident, but still open to that. Thirdly, the presidency of the EU in Cyprus has also been affected. The General Affairs Council had to be cancelled like that. There are 130 flights that have been cancelled to Cyprus. Lufthansa and EasyJet have suspended flights until further notice. Paphos Airport closed down for a day. There's a suffocating dependency on mazout and heavy oil that I think it's going to be felt very, very quickly. Inflationary pressures, physical supply, and underdeveloped, to be kind to its civil protection system, and only 40% population has access to shelters. So to critics, a joke of an early warning system. In the medium term, there's obviously the possibility of terrorism. There have been at least 3 or 4 assassination plots unveiled by the Cypriot authorities in conjunction with Mossad, of Israeli assassins wishing to operate in the Republic of Cyprus against Israeli targets. Energy, as I say, both price-wise and supply-wise. Tourism, it's supposed to start this month, and tourism is the #1 revenue to the state, bringing in 3 billion euros. That is going to suffer very specifically, and obviously politically, in the sense that there's general elections in May, and the way that the government has been shown to be not particularly strong, or the problematic handling might backfire. And lastly, in the long term, we're talking about obviously the severe blow of this war to international legality as we knew it, to principles, public international law, the international legal order, with the normalization of the exception and the legitimization of bullying, if you like. So what happens to countries like Cyprus that have tried for decades to build a foreign policy, or at least the narrative of a foreign policy, on international law? What happens when international institutions like the United Nations that have been holding all the process together are withering away and dying? What happened to revisionism here, where the Republic of Cyprus, to critics, has been part of the problem with bypassing International Criminal Court decisions vis-à-vis Mr. Netanyahu. Its presence is even as an observer to the Board of Peace, the appeasement or pleasing of Donald Trump. This might have helped in the very end. Finally, a couple of questions to get us thinking a little bit, if you like. I think this war highlights the security dilemma divergence between the North and the South. This brings to the core issues not perhaps apparent to the northern partners, the equivalent of Ukraine, if you like. What happens when different threats exist for the southern partners? But to be more provocative, what happens if tomorrow morning Turkey decides to also send in warships to protect, in a narrative, the Turkish Cypriots? Even worse, what if Turkey steps in a narrative to send a navy to protect the whole of Cyprus, being a guarantor state as per treaties for the whole of Cyprus? What happens if the United States asks specifically the Republic of Cyprus if they demand facilitation of the US Air Force in the Andreas Papandreou base? What happens to the pending applications of Iranians in the Republic? What happens to 12,000 Iranians living permanently in northern Cyprus that could perhaps be understood as de facto refugees? These, I think, are some of the questions that arise, and I'm sure some of them will be tackled by my very worthy colleagues on migration. Many thanks.
Thank you so much, Harry, for giving us the broader picture in such a clear and concise way, as always, and for linking also with the issue of migration that we want this to be, the central theme of today's webinar, and more to follow, of course, in the coming days, hopefully. So without further ado, we are getting into the subject of migration. Just to give a couple of hints, although we have seen no noticeable flows yet, in the flows, the European Commission officials are trying to appear reassuring in the front. Yes, yet, with the escalation of the clashes in many fronts, things are getting more and more complicated. So I want to give the floor to my colleague, Kyriaki Hatzipanagiotou, our policy officer in Cyprus, to give us the current migration outlook in the region. Kyriaki, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Eleni, and thank you everyone for joining us. I would like to first start by saying that migration dynamics in Cyprus cannot be understood in isolation from the developments across the wider Middle East, which goes to everything that Harry covered before me as well. We see there is an escalation as a continuation of the overlapping pressures that the region is experiencing. For example, armed conflict, political instability, and large-scale displacement, which in turn shape migration movements toward Europe and by extension toward Cyprus. Before zooming in to better understand the situation in Cyprus, I would just like to remind ourselves in this discussion that the countries that are currently directly or indirectly involved in this escalation, for example, Lebanon and Iran, are countries that are also major hosts of refugee and displaced population in their countries, which these shows the importance and the interconnection between Cyprus and the region and potential mass displacements in Lebanon, for example, where 1.5 million Syrian refugees are being hosted. At the same time, the country is undergoing severe financial difficulties, and at the moment we speak, evacuations are being managed en masse in the southern border due to renewed tensions with Israel. So we can see how the immediate region that Cyprus is neighbored with can lead to large-scale movements and displacement within those countries, but also secondary migration towards Europe and Cyprus. And to highlight Cyprus' exposure in this bigger landscape, I would also like to highlight some structural vulnerabilities that the country holds because of its geographical and political situation. So geographical-wise, given that Cyprus is the most external EU border of the EU, the physical distance between mainland Europe and Cyprus makes it very difficult for the country to rely on rapid assistance and support. And I'm not talking about military in military terms necessarily. This can also be the case in other emergencies like wildfire or humanitarian situations. So lack of proximity with Europe and the close proximity with the Middle East is a structural challenge that impacts how migration dynamics are understood in Cyprus. Another vulnerabilities, like Haris mentioned before me, the ongoing political division. Because of this division, Cyprus cannot have a unified migration and asylum governance system, which makes it even more difficult to implement policies, roll out operations across the countries, and in an effort to better streamline and provide the support that's needed for the refugee population in the country. So these two vulnerabilities increase the Cyprus exposures to potential regional instability, and potentially migration pressures can hit fast the country. I don't want to be all to sound so negative. I want to say that Cyprus today, it is much better prepared than it was in the previous crisis during the Syrian war. For example, following the 22 peak in arrivals, when Cyprus had the highest rate of asylum seekers in the European Union, we have seen a gradual decrease, which is, of course, a main component of that is the fall of the Assad regime in Syria in late 2024. The European Union Lebanon package deal of 1 billion to support Lebanon in migration and border management. Internally, the establishment of the migration, the Deputy Ministry of Migration and International Protection, as well as institutional capacity in the sense of expanding reception capacity and accommodation centers in the coming months. But in spite of the above, although Cyprus appears to be better prepared, it cannot on its own address any potential high flows of refugees that may come towards Europe, and it does require a more unified approach on that. If I have time, Eleni, I can also give a very quick outlook for the European level. As you all know, Cyprus is currently presiding the rotating presidency of the European Union. The government has been very active and vocal about in the ongoing discussions for the upcoming implementation of the new pact on migration and asylum that will be enforced in in June, and has been advocating, for the adoption of the list of safe countries of origin, the updating of the safe third countries concept for return mechanisms and innovative solutions to turn people who don't have a legal right to remain in the Cyprus. So these are some of the priorities that the government has been pushing through the EU presidency in terms of migration and asylum. And at the same time, the government has been very vocal in consistently calling for responsibility sharing among the EU member states and the solidarity in not only in financial terms, but also in practical and operational terms. So I would like to close that this current escalation, it's an early stress test for the European Union to see whether we are better prepared to manage this escalation better than what we did during the Syrian war. And I think following closely the developments in the region, we will be able to monitor how an early implementation of the pact will be implemented in practice. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kyriaki, for these very insightful comments. I just cannot resist the temptation of taking advantage for 1 minute of my role of having the mic and saying that yes, Cyprus, as many countries like Greece, are also much more prepared than they used to be, but at the same time, preparedness in terms of reception structure or administrative capacity can get you up to a point. And this might not the point that we will end ourselves finding into. I'm saying that because, most of us were here back in 2015, and we have seen since 2013, we have been seeing the UN giving out all these warnings about the potential crisis in the EU borders. The civil war in Syria had already erupted since 2011, but 4 years later, Europe did not seem very, very ready. And also, the whole EU Pact on Migration and Asylum, let's say, experiment is being delivered all these years as a way of Europe not finding itself in the same position. I'm saying all this because it is very, very important to have all this in mind. Because with the conflicts, with all these classes being generalized across the region, we need to be much more vigilant in terms of foresight and preparedness on what is coming. And having said that, I'm giving the floor to, let's say, a veteran of preparedness and foresight, who knows the field very, very well. Elizabeth Kassinis, the executive manager of Caritas in Cyprus, and also a dear friend, if I may, that knows the humanitarian field very well in Cyprus, and will also give us her view of the situation. Elizabeth, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Eleni. Thank you to MedMA for organizing this sort of rapid reaction event on a sort of day's notice. The nice thing about coming third after Harry and Kyriaki is that I get to pick up on a lot of their themes because we've already sort of established a baseline for our discussion. It's often said that Cyprus is at a geostrategic crossroads, and that Cyprus is complicated. And I think those statements are trite, but they are also very true right now. Since antiquity, through all of the periods of history, medieval, Venetian, Ottoman, colonial, modern, anything going into this region and coming out somehow touches this little island with all of its complications. And just looking at sort of international involvement in conflicts, in beginning the prep for the first Iraq war, for example, was all done, the contingency planning was all done from here. And so this sort of Cyprus as a launch pad for going in and for movements in for different things is from then. More recently, we have, of course, the establishment of the Amalfi corridor for the assistance to Gaza and setting up of humanitarian corridors and pathways to get help in. Coming out, we have the largest evacuation of Americans, at least, but also of other third country nationals from Lebanon in 2006, which again provided a lot of lessons for what went into the development of the Estia plan that the Republic now has that's been used to do orderly departures and evacuations from places like Sudan in 2023. And then, of course, in the whole broader frame of migration, as Kireki also mentioned, we've had this period since 2018 where you've had sort of intended and unintended migration. The largest per capita asylum seeker, for example, population in all of Europe for most of this period. And so it's a pretty, this is sort of the groundwork. But so Cyprus, as Harry very wisely said in the beginning, is in the region, but a little bit outside of the region and scope of conflict, but not true, I don't think, today in the same way right now. I mean, with the drone strike in Akrotiri and with the sort of close and very public alliance and alignment of Cyprus with Israel, I think that Cyprus is not only in the region, but it's actually in play more so. And this, of course, then changes its position, either as a forward position or a staging area or a humanitarian hub, whatever we want to call it, as well as its ability to be a refuge or sort of a place of refuge or a point of onward departure. I've been asked to reflect a little bit on the factors that might affect the humanitarian landscape. So, I mean, I would posit that I think the first thing we have to consider is size. Cyprus is small, and so its market is small, and this creates bottlenecks. So even if all of a sudden you had flows, which we can talk about later about whether that's likely and where they come from, the fact is that it's small and you end up with a lot of limited capacity to do things like house people. I mean, we are far better off now than we were in 2006 when we had the Lebanese, where you were using, World War II, I kid you not, World War II surplus cots that the civil defense were putting up in the fairgrounds. I don't think Cyprus is there. We've come a long way since then. But as you were saying, Eleni, that capacity can very quickly be stripped. We think we're ready until that happens. And your only options are the limited camp and facilities. And then, of course, beds in hotels. I mean, they exist, but they're costly and they're not very convenient. The other thing is that Cyprus is now dealing with preparedness. I mean, when we talk about preparedness, always it was looking at what might come this way. But the fact is that there may be an emergency here. I mean, relocating the village, the small amounts of villages from Akrotiri and from around the British bases, may not have been a Herculean task for right now, but in fact, it's shed light on many of the shortcomings that need to be remedied with local systems. I mean, whether it's the messaging system that they tried last night or the shelters, this infrastructure has been neglected, and it's difficult to reach the local population. You can only imagine how it is also very difficult to then reach the marginalized populations. I'll offer one small sort of grassroots vignette into this. Last night, the system, the Ministry of Interior tried to send out a message to all the population through cell phones, and then we had to delete hundreds of messages from the Caritas phones today because the people who come to us for advice couldn't understand what precautionary self-protection measures meant, or where they were supposed to find, they went to shelters that as they were directed from Safe Cyprus and didn't find what they were looking for and couldn't understand. And so, I mean, again, this is just another complication that I think resources will have to get diverted to deal with local preparedness, as opposed to just preparing for evacuees or for, the third country nationals or people, refugee flows that might come this way, or even the special humanitarian cases that have been thought of. I mean, if we assume that Cyprus somehow regains a safe, gets over the fact that and people start to move and it's considered as a destination, I would make a few points. The first is that geography is going to be its best defense. It's hard to get here. Kireki already said it's hard to get from here to Europe, but it's hard to get here generally, so being an island. So that will limit a little bit the spontaneous flows. There are a lot of ships in between the very troubled waters, and so that will limit to some degree, assuming, of course, that we don't, again, have some inflow from the Turkish Cypriot community and from Turkey. But it's also unlikely that any controlled arrivals will be allowed to come without guarantees of onward departure. I mean, I hate to end on a cynical note, but I am, in that I'm not sure it would take a lot for the government of Cyprus to change its perspective on the fact that it's got too many migrants and too many people who shouldn't be here. And so any arrivals, regardless of circumstances, will have to be under very controlled circumstances, and they don't get to stay. So unless they're going to leave, this is all about removals and returns. And so I think that this is a real consideration. So anyway, as I said, thank you. I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. And this last point, I think this is very important. We have been seeing this in many countries, like this compassion fatigue. That's, since 2015. It's a buzzword that all governments use in the sense that, we cannot take enough. So no matter what the circumstances are, it seems that we start from a point zero of compassion. This is something that, maybe we can, if we have some minutes after the initial inputs, then we could also discuss. That would be very, very interesting. But before we go that, I will also give the floor to last but not least, Manos Moschopoulos, our senior advisor, currently in Berlin, monitoring the situation. Manos, Cyprus holds the presidency of the Council this semester. I mean, this has been a very hot presidency. At the same time, we see the informal meeting of the Minister of European Affairs has been postponed like 2 days ago. As we speak, there is a Justice and Home Affairs Council that is heavily focused on security and what's happening in the region. So I just wanted your take on what's the situation from an EU perspective and whatever you can share with us as information as well. The floor is yours.
So thank you, Eleni, and thanks for the initiative for putting this together today. Of course, meetings are being held online under Cyprus's chairmanship because of the situation and the fact that travel to Cyprus has become more difficult. Here in Berlin, there was a set of in-person meetings yesterday. We had Commissioner Marta Kos in town. And of course, what Commissioner Kos is looking at is how new models can give birth to new EU enlargement efforts. But the situation in the Middle East means that Turkey has emerged as a country of great importance for the European Union again. In her statement to Politicos, she was talking about how important Turkey is for migration management. That was followed by a statement by President von der Leyen, who discussed with President Erdogan and thanked him in her statement for preparing for what she called the potential increase in renewed refugee movements, or the potential impact of this crisis on migration, rather. So far as everyone has said, we haven't seen that, right? We haven't seen a large-scale increase in these international movements. We are told that onward movements to Azerbaijan are in the hundreds. We know that Turkey has had restrictions on its border for the crossing of Iranian citizens. That could be part of what President von der Leyen was discussing in terms of preparedness. There are reports of other Iranian nationals being held at that particular border. But so far, we haven't seen this kind of big international displacement. The worrying news from today, of course, is that around 400,000 to 500,000 people have been told they need to evacuate their homes in the southern suburbs of Beirut, which would mean a tenfold increase in the number of internally displaced people in Lebanon, if that happens to be something that isn't a one-off but becomes a more protracted situation. And that could also mean, of course, adding to the roughly 11,000 people that were seen crossing towards Syria in recent days. So everyone has spoken about how important it is that the EU prepares, and I'm going to also add to that, because a protracted conflict leads to more displacement, and the countries in the region need to be supported, especially places like Lebanon, as they deal with the consequences of this internal displacement. And that's something that needs to get on the agenda of the EU. And in fact, Lebanon was being discussed today, was planned to be discussed, because Lebanon, alongside Libya, are two of the EU's most important partners when it comes to its approach to migration management at the moment. And given the situation, supporting Lebanon has become even more crucial than it was before for a European Union that wants to avoid large-scale irregular migration towards its borders. Now, of course, in the scenario that international displacement does happen towards the European Union, the European Union would hope that the pact would make it more ready than it was in the past to address such situations. And we've already heard from the colleagues in Cyprus how prepared or not prepared Cyprus or Greece or other places would be. The EU doesn't need to prepare for this kind of displacement because it's the most likely scenario, but it has to prepare for it because it is a scenario. And a very important part of that is what kind of support will be given to countries like Cyprus and Greece and so on. Given the focus of governments like Germany's on preventing secondary movements within the European Union, and the lack of enthusiasm, let's say, for the solidarity pool and that part of the Pact's arrangements, I think the thinking now needs to be, right, so how can we support these frontline countries, take a bit of the responsibility as well, right, when it comes to support through the solidarity pool and without, in order to avoid bad management, in order to be able to actually manage the situation in a fair and dignified way. Given that, as someone said, Cyprus is a 20-minute flight from Beirut, right? And Greece is right across from Turkey, which still is a visa-free destination for Iranian people. So you would think this support is much needed when it comes to managing the situation. Now, the other item of concern, I'll close with that, out here in the more northern parts of Europe is what happens to the nationals that are stranded at the moment in the Middle East. And that will be a big part of the discussions. Several EU member states, including Germany and Cyprus, have evacuated nationals through Oman. Croatia Airlines plane was landing in Dubai recently. There's more efforts like that happening. Given how much this conflict has affected countries across the region. Cyprus's role, as was mentioned, was very crucial in these efforts. And I think part of what the EU needs to be thinking about next is who can play this role, and how does this look like if Cyprus is not able to play this role in the coming weeks. So in an hour and a half, more or less, we'll hear from the press conference, Eleni, from the Home Affairs Council. So maybe we'll know if they've taken stock of any of this. But I think in the coming days, we'll still be calling for more preparedness. So thanks.
Yeah, thanks. Let's see about that. And also, just also an interesting note is that one of the main items of the informal meeting of the Ministers of European Affairs that was postponed this week was the MMF, the new multi-annual framework program, which is also something that should be put in. I mean, discussion about how potentially countries affected can also be supported in terms of money, which is also a very big parameter of what will be needed if things go even worse. And just before I give the floor to all of you guys for answering to a couple of questions that have come in, just also to put a couple of more information on the table. Apart from everything that you mentioned, Manos, we know that flows are already being reported at the borders of Azerbaijan. So, I mean, there are people moving already somewhere. We know also that there is growing tension between Pakistan and Afghanistan even before the war has started, which is also making things more complicated because, I mean, the Afghani population might be also pushed towards the Iran. So, I mean, I'm just saying that because things are getting more and more complex, and I get this feeling that we have been there before in early 2010s. And this, I believe that, I mean, we should not be, pessimistic, but we should be as prepared as possible. And when I say we, I hope I mean the European Union as a whole. I will make sure I will give you the floor to react to a couple of questions that have been raised and to whatever, of course, you want to chip into the conversation before we close. I have a couple of questions that have come in. One is, may I ask, can you go into more details on why wouldn't Cyprus be able to have a coherent migration asylum policy in terms of in case of crisis? I assume this goes to everybody who wants to react to that. There is also a question about what will happen with asylum claims of Iranian nationals. If there's any information, because I mean, Harry also mentioned a big number of people in the north, but also potential other flows arriving in Cyprus. What will happen? We know Greece. There's already from Greece, which is an example always bad or good, depending. There is already an announcement about postponing the processing of asylum claims. I don't know if there's something like that of this sort in Cyprus. And also, this is my personally one question, what you would make of this compassion fatigue and how EU countries and the Cypriot government can play a more positive role in that, given that we could be close to a crisis, bigger or shorter. So I will give the floor to the panelists from how we started. So Harry, do you want to go first? And whatever you want to discuss, I mean.
No, because I think the expertise in the room is heavily leaning on the migration. Let me just say two things, if I may, framework-wise still. One, I really think that this is an opportunity. I'm not going to say good or bad opportunity, but an opportunity even within the presidency of the EU to somehow, even indirectly, even from the back door, even with a number of caveats on non-recognition, view the reality on the ground that has to do with the northern side of the island. Whatever you do, as long as you don't recognize, still there are individuals there. There is a situation that can potentially become explosive. Hopefully not. But I remind to everyone, the north of the island is EU territory, and the Turkish Cypriots at least are EU citizens. So in the way that this is affected within an EU framework, I think we need to have a pragmatic discussion beyond fixations. And the second thing I wanted to say is that migration and security go hand in hand in a very interesting way here. I would suggest that we open up the agenda to other things. What I mean to say is that security, especially obviously now, and that's understandable through a strategic crisis, but security has been viewed very, very narrowly. And that has to do also with Ukraine in the way that we approach things in Europe with rearm and all of that. I think this is leaving out very crucial things that, to me, should come into the discussion. So the suggestion is to open up the agenda to understand security more broadly construed and conceptualized. And Cyprus is an interesting, useful, horrible, good example in the way it brings together migration, hard security, water problems, connectivity problems, environmental issues, infrastructure issues, vulnerabilities, deficits, inequalities, poverty, you name it. These are, to me, the real challenges that will plague us beyond the hostilities of this war that will finish hopefully very soon. Ukraine, that also will hopefully finish soon. But all of these, I think, are there to stay with us, and we need to understand them as crucial security issues. But this could also pave the way towards understanding, in the sense that we're united by the bonds of common suffering in all this. So if we act together on this, hopefully it will pave the way towards cooperation in other fields. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you for providing some hope as well. Kyriakimu?
Thank you. I will go first with Yusef's question. I'm not sure if my references to the recent adoption of an integration strategy is what caused the question by Yusef, but I will ask it in a more general term. So for those who may not be familiar with the ground situation in the country, the northern part of the island is currently occupied by Turkey, and therefore the implementation of a coherent migration and asylum policy across the island, although all of the territory is part of the European Union, technically cannot be implemented. And while there has been cooperation between the two communities on managing different daily issues that may appear, like electricity connectivity, telecommunications, security, criminality, etc., migration is not one of the topics that the two communities have been collaborating in order to have a unified approach and better communication on arrivals, flows, and also ensuring that there is a safer and dignified passage from one side to another. So I hope this, Yusef, answers the question on why we currently do not have a unified system of migration governance in the whole of the island, and why this limits Cyprus' capacity to manage migration more effectively and in a dignified way. And I think there was another question about what would happen to Iranian asylum seekers in Cyprus. Formally, we don't have an announcement yet by the Asylum Service of the Deputy Ministry on how it will be treating pending asylum applications by Syria and how it is expected to handle potential incoming Iranian asylum applicants. What we can expect, and based on what Eleni also mentioned before, by offering the practice that has just been adopted in Greece. Eleni, correct me if I'm wrong, but as I understand, Greece has essentially made the examination process much more much more detailed,
strict.
much more strict. Thank you. And essentially, we expect that potential member states will be expecting to see if the regime in Iran will collapse, so as to come back and say the conditions for which you claimed asylum are no longer there, so you will not be granted protection. But I must say, I find it a bit concerning in the midst of, you know, all this escalation and people being directly affected by conflict and displacement, initiating a discussion of, okay, how can we limit Iranian people's access to shelter and asylum?
Well, again, I get to be lucky third because Gireki addressed most of this. I mean, I think the question about Iranian, you know, asylum claims and what I think a lot of it will have to do with what people assess the situation in Iran will be, what the situation in Iran is. We have the case of the Syrian population, sort of the quick rush to try and have Syria be immediately a safe country, right? I mean, in this idea that somehow you could have safe returns. I think so. How the Cypriots as well as the Europeans begin to conceive of what is happening in Iran and what that will mean for asylum cases either already in the pipeline, or because it'll be another excuse to hold the ones that are in the pipeline and not address them, and not to accept new ones, or to leave them in abeyance as they did with the Syrians starting in 2022, I think it was. So, I mean, I think that's the issue. I don't have an answer for compassion fatigue. I think that this is something that is going to haunt us, that has been haunting us, and that will haunt us for some time now. And especially as, you know, we still haven't resolved Syria, right? And the challenge that it posed to European institutions and to Cyprus specifically, I'm not sure what that will mean for Iran. And then I will try and end on a hopeful note, which runs counter sometimes to my nature, and pull on what Harry said, that I think we do have an opportunity. You know, Cyprus is small enough. I mean, again, the irony is that it's small enough with so many of these things that you could pick, it's within your control to pick one or two of these or three of these issues and actually kind of hash out something that might work and that could then be extrapolated for the bigger picture. But so thanks.
Thank you so much, Isabel. So we are already 6 minutes over time, but I'm sure everybody is still here. So Manos, a word from Berlin before we close.
A quick thought on what Tihome asked. Like, obviously, Harry mentioned the lack of bicommunal migration management, let's call it that way, right? And this is something I've heard as well from people in the north, that there is this call for more cooperation on these matters. I think that an increase in arrivals or the displacement of Iranians already in the north part of on the occupied part of the island could complicate things like Schengen accession, etc. So it is something that the EU needs to start preparing for and figure out how that can be managed. But overall, I think I'll close with something the Cypriot migration minister said in recent days, that you know, Cyprus does have a lot of experience of displacement in Lebanon, and that's mostly internal. And reading the news and reading EU sources talking to media about, oh, but Iran is 90 million people, what's going to happen? That cannot be a substitute for planning, right? Either thinking, okay, this will never become international displacement from a place like Iran, but also that, you know, what's going to happen? The gates are going to open. I don't think suspending the examination of asylum claims of Iranians is a substitute for planning either. It can offer, let's say, a little bit of time to plan for things, right? But if there were to be a large-scale displacement from the Middle East towards Europe, it would not be hindered by a bureaucratic measure like that. So the EU really needs to first figure out, in the so far not the likeliest scenario that there is such displacement, what does it do? And second, how does it support Cyprus, Greece, and other countries that will have to potentially receive people? But yeah, I think we've thank you for putting this together, because this was very useful to take stock of the situation on the island and what's happening. And I hope it's not going to be protracted enough that we have to get back together in a few weeks to see what happened. So thanks.
Thank you, Manos. Thank you, everybody. And let's close here with the hope that this will de-escalate quickly, and that next time in the next webinar we will be talking about the agenda of the Cypriot presidency as we wanted to in MEDMA. That was the initial thought, but unfortunately the developments were not very, in favor of that. So thank you, Harry. Thank you, Kyriaki. Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, Manos, and thank you to everybody who was here. And until next time, have a lovely evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.